Welcome to Our Father's House with me, Amanda Clinton. On today's programme, we're going to be looking at one of the biggest curses in the 21st century, which is, self-indulgence, essentially. And in that view, I'm just going to give the definition for self-indulgence, and that is excessive indulgence of one's own appetites and desires. Once again, excessive indulgence of one's own appetite and desires. And the scripture I have in mind for today's topic is taken from Ecclesiastes 2 from verse 4 to 11. Once again, Ecclesiastes 2 from verse 4 to 11, which reads, I made great works, I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks and planted in them all kinds of fruits and trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. I bought male and female servants and had slaves who were born in my house. I had also great possessions of herds and flocks, more than anyone who had been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasures of kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, the delight of the children of man. So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me, and whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had expended in doing it, and behold, all was vanity, and a striving after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. And that was just taken from Ecclesiastes 2 from verse 4 to 11, because on Our Father's House today we're going to be looking at one of the biggest curses, in my view, in the 21st century, and that is to be self-indulgent. And it's almost as if, there's an epidemic of obsessions today, food, drink, one's own personal agenda. What have you done for me lately kind of attitude. And everyone wants more, we want more for the less work that we do. We want to indulge, but we don't know when to discipline ourselves. It's always about what can I get in this situation? How can I self-indulge? Therefore, as you go out this morning, what are you doing in your life that is excessive? What do you indulge in? What do you constantly need to fulfill your appetite and your desire? In all that you do you just indulge in it for yourself? And are you building the kingdom whilst doing so? It's easy, therefore, I think, to indulge in the 21st century. Everything is quick, everything is ready-made, it can be brought for a price. We can have anything our hearts desires. All, as the preacher says in Ecclesiastes, is vanity, and there is nothing to be gained under the sun. And I think the preacher in Ecclesiastes said that because there is nothing that we have done that hasn't been done before in terms of centuries before us. It's just been repackaged, redone. And there is nothing new under the sun, and there is nothing to be gained under the sun. Because ultimately, what does it benefit a man if he gains the world and loses his soul? Since the dust will return to the earth, and the spirit will return to God who gave it. And so if we spend our lives in vanity, if we spend our lives in all the self-indulgence that we can possibly muster up for ourselves, and we crave these things, we are obsessed with these things, we are addicted to the things that make us happy, and yet we gain nothing because there is this emptiness. We must endeavour to be self-disciplined, because even if it is easier said than done sometimes, once you pull back on all the things that you indulge on, once you limit them to fewer things, once you engage in what it is to die to your physical self and its needs, and try and just do it in terms of, try and just live a self-disciplined life, the more and more you try, the more you have the chance of overcoming, even if you fail sometimes. And ultimately, are we truly walking the Christian walk? In our lives, if our hearts desire to do all these things, are we walking the walk, or are we just talking the talk? Christians do that very well, the hypocrisies very well. And yet our God is looking for a sincere people with a sincere heart and sincere devotion to worshipping and serving him as he has called us out to do. And are we truly, if we ask ourselves quite sincerely in our hearts, walking the Christian walk, if we don't rest in our hearts from all the pleasures that we want, if we just continue in all these pleasures? And are we truly walking the Christian walk if our only reward in life is the delight of, where we find our pleasure, essentially? When we analyse our days, our indulgences, our weaknesses, is all of it vanity? Because as Ecclesiastes 2 says, the vanity of self-indulgence leads to nothing to be gained in life under the sun. Because ultimately, if you focus on everything that your heart desires, everything is for pleasure, if you do it because, you gain this pleasure that you can't get from anything else, and that's all that matters, how to satisfy yourself, then all is vanity, because even that will come to pass when we die. And if we don't learn how to grow spiritually, if we don't learn how to die to our carnal needs, because we're not going to have carnal needs in the afterlife, and as such we must endeavour to start building ourselves as spiritual beings. And in focusing on what will prevent us from engaging in the kingdom, because ultimately our indulgences stop us from engaging in the real kingdom that God left behind for us, is that it's the biggest curse today to be self-indulgent. It is the curse of the 21st century. It is the curse of what have you done for me lately? It is the curse of self-gratification. It is the curse of I won't do it unless it benefits me. And whatever it is that is our situation this morning in terms of what we personally indulge in, be it power, the opposite sex, drink, control, we need to, I think, as Christians, know how to overcome self-indulgent urges. Because in overcoming this attitude of what have you done for me lately, we will at least endeavour to engage in what it is that is the Christian walk, which is, to give up, to die to yourself, to sacrifice, to turn the other cheek, to at least attempt to help your fellow man, to at least be sincere in your heart about your intentions and why it is you do what you do. To overcome, therefore, self-indulgence and the vanity of just always worshipping yourself, as Ecclesiastes 2 states, we need to acknowledge what it is that we actually do in excess that has to stop, because there has to be a certain level, I think, of acknowledgement, a certain level of knowing what it is that holds you, of knowing that it is your particular addiction, because once we acknowledge what it is that we indulge in, then we can start dealing with it in terms of how we can cut back on our excessive urges, and how we can start building the inner man, the spiritual man, as the Apostle Paul spoke about, and developing to the next stage. Because ultimately, I don't think we are building ourselves up in any way If we focus too much on the pleasure we gain for ourselves, and even that is vanity. Most of us are Christians, yet we have to stop being the kind of useless, ineffective Christians that are always learning and never able to come to the real knowledge of the truth and the realization of what it is that the Bible says, as 11 Timothy chapter 3 from verse 6 confirms. Being obsessed with only what we can get, what we can gain in this life, being self-indulgent, as the writer in Ecclesiastic 2 writes, with our toys, with our power moves, with our games, with our vices, all just leaves us spiritually empty, because we say openly that we are Christians, yet if we self-indulge, we are like the Pharisees, we are like the hypocrites, and we are, pretending to live this clean life, but inside we are ultimately greedy and self-indulgent. We therefore, I think, have a true barrier in the 21st century in engaging in the Christian kingdom that Jesus left behind for us, in being excessive with all that we do, just for our desire, just for our gratification, to please ourselves, to spoil ourselves. We want luxury, we want control. But how can we grow spiritually if we have nothing inside us and just have the vanity of spiritual indulgence reigning inside us? We ultimately, I think, need to overcome our self-indulgence, because it leads to an attitude of false security. It leads to, seeking and not searching for spiritual mature growth. It is about promoting ourselves, our agenda, our obsessions, our gratifications, and selfish desires. All the things that Jesus was against, because it leads, in the end, nowhere. As the writer in Ecclesiastes writes, he says that there's nothing to be gained under the sun, because at the end of the day, as the Bible also confirms, the spirit will return to God who gave it, and ultimately the ashes were returned to the ground. And Jesus was against, I think, this whole idea of just self-promotion, obsession, self-indulgence, false security, and just seeking physical growth and not mature, spiritual immaturity, essentially, because it was all about greed, it's all about having lust, it's all about control. And ultimately, when one engages in the world and everything it has to offer, when one lives a life that is truly self-indulgent in anything you want and how you want it and when you want it and how quickly you want it, the irony you find is that even if you master the game of life and how to get everything you want, how you want it and when you want it and in the time that you want it, is that it still leaves a feeling of emptiness. It still doesn't make us happy. It still doesn't take us to the next level we still want. And we see that even in Hollywood. You have all these people that beat the odds in terms of just millions and millions of people wanted to be successful in Hollywood. And yet they were the chosen ones. They were the ones that the public accepted. They were the ones who got the contracts, the deals, the £1 million deals that, just launched their career. And the one thing they elude about constantly, I think every famous person has spoken about this, is the loneliness, the isolation, the feeling of, I thought if I became famous, I thought if I had all these things, and even if people worshipped me, I would feel fulfilled, I would feel loved. And then they talk about this emptiness instead, this emptiness that is worse than when they were alone, this emptiness that when the crowds go home, when the people stop clapping, they are in their hotel rooms and all they feel is this complete sense of isolation and this complete sense of withdrawal that leads some of them to indulge in drugs and everything that will give them that temporary escape. And so as we focus on the vanity of self-indulgence, let us also make it real and practical to us in terms of, let us acknowledge the fact that the reason it is important, the Bible tells us, not to be self-indulgent is that once we become the center of it all, once we become the monument, once we become our own gods that we serve, and once we forget to build the kingdom in terms of we forget to help other people and all these different things, then we lose sight of what it is that Jesus wanted us to do, because ultimately in serving ourselves and our own devices will lead us nowhere, because we die and we'll have to deal in a spiritual currency. So sowing into building oneself up spiritually ultimately helps them in life, because the afterlife is not a shock to the system, it's not a shock to the soul, because those things that you started building on earth in terms of spiritual maturity, in terms of just helping everything around you, in terms of contributing to the body and not just the individual self, applies in the afterlife, because souls act in unison and souls continue that spiritual journey of building that kingdom. Yet if we indulge in ourselves, if we indulge in our carnality, if we forget what it is that God's plan is, if we forget what it is that He has asked us to do, then in death all we will face is darkness, because there is no human body to serve. There are no other people to worship and play power moves with. There is no money in the afterlife. There is simply a spiritual currency. And so if we don't engage in this spiritual walk in life, then in the afterlife we will truly be lost, because how can we engage in something that we never engaged in life? How can we start 60, 70, 80 years later when we had all that time to prepare ourselves? So therefore, let us not miss our opportunity to prepare ourselves even for our deaths, because the vanity of self-indulgence is that you might become very good at being a master of your own game. You might be very good at serving other people till you get what you want. You might be other good at following the instructions of leaders and men of power. And yet our soul is in our own keeping. And when we get to our God, we cannot say that I was told to do this by that person, or that virtue was not convenient at the time. This will not suffice. It will not be enough for our Maker. So let us endeavor to just treat our souls as our own, in terms of our own that is been given from God. And we're having this temporary experience, and because our souls are our own in terms of we have free will, but we know we can do better, let us endeavor to give it all to our God, because the God that gave us that soul in the first place, the God that foreknew us and predestined us, the God that still wants us to make it out alive in terms of our souls, making it back to Him without being scarred, is still concerned with how our journey is going. And so if we engage in the 21st century with not being self-indulgent, not just thinking about what can this situation do for me, if we engage in getting to the next level, if we engage in knowing that there is so much more to life than just serving ourselves, then we will start knowing what it is to be a real Christian. We will start knowing what it is to die to our flesh, even if it hurts. We will start knowing how to give to others, and then finding, ironically, that we get so much satisfaction from sharing with others than hoarding for ourselves, because we see the delight and we see the growth in other people, and ultimately we don't feel this emptiness, because when you indulge, when you do it to the point of being a master at it, what you find as you go back to your home, as you go back where nobody is looking, is that you still have this sense of emptiness. So let us therefore endeavor to feed this soul that is longing to be fed, to water this soul that is longing to just breathe in this earth, because at the end of the day, it is so unfamiliar for our souls to just keep engaging in just feeding the flesh. and neglecting the soul. It is so alien for the soul to just indulge in the great I am without sharing a spiritual currency of acknowledging your fellow man and just building the kingdom that our God gave us. And so we therefore ultimately, I think, need to know how to overcome a self-indulgent life, because it often leads to poverty. It often leads to spiritual emptiness and death, spiritual death ultimately. Because in the afterlife there is no human body. In the afterlife there are no other people to impress. In the afterlife there is no money. And so if you don't engage in building yourself spiritually, then it won't be worth it eventually. And to live in pleasure is just to desire only one's own comfort, pleasure, and not building God's spiritual house for generations and generations to come. Because even if you do live a great life in terms of the world acknowledges you as being great, and you have all these accolades, and even in your death they say wonderful things about you, and they dress in black and white, and posters are put up, and there's a huge procession, and there's even a huge marble for your face on your tomb to celebrate the monument that was the great person that was there. Everybody else will still go home. Everybody else will still move on. And in generations and generations to come, they will move on. But if you sow into a spiritual self, if you sow into building others, then that in itself will last for generations to generations, because you would have built people up to such an extent that when they pass on the knowledge that you have given them for generations and generations to come, it will be endless, and it will be a testimony of what and who your God is. And so let us not build a monument for ourselves, because that monument will be so small in time to come, and people will stop coming to our graves, and they will no longer worship the person that cannot give them money any longer, that is no longer there to pretend to. Therefore, let us build ourselves spiritually so that what we sow into others will affect them for generations and generations to come, in their children and their children's children. And that is how we will know we were truly great, because even in our death, what we are and who we are as Christians still lives on in other people. And I ultimately think that in concentrating on our Father's house today, on Ecclesiastes 2, the vanity of self-indulgence, we also need to acknowledge the fact that we need to overcome a self-indulgent lifestyles, because all of it leads to excessively going after more of the world's pleasures, and it is never enough. It doesn't satisfy us. Self-indulgence leads to all sorts of addictions that cripples our minds, cripples our souls, and cripples our bodies. Without God's truth and his principles directly applied in our life, we see no reason to stop going after the pleasures of life. If we continue in all this vanity, however, in only being self-indulgent, we directly and indirectly reject God. Because as Deuteronomy 32 talks of Israel essentially, and how individual Israelites grew fat and kicked, rejecting God. An example is used in Deuteronomy 32 of a pampered animal which, instead of being tame and gentle, becomes mischievous and vicious as a result of good living and being spoilt. We are the modern Israelites, therefore. If we remain in this self-indulgent state as Christians, craving for power and craving for anything that feeds us each and every way, then we are serving our own body as gods. We are serving our own gods in food, drink, partners, power moves, and numerous false doctrines based on happiness and not God and his way of doing things. We are not the real church of Christ if we continue to self-indulge, if we are not sincere about God's word and what he has committed us to do. We are not the real church if we remain self-indulgent. We are not the real church if we don't put our own personal desires and pleasures under subjection of the will of God. The vanity of self-indulgence, as the preacher describes in Ecclesiastic 2, also leads us to being the weakest of all in terms of our spiritual walk. Because we have to remember that Satan is the greatest deceiver, who takes the same temptation that existed hundreds of years ago and literally just repackages it. Then he puts it in a 21st century way, in a new, slightly different form, and presents it to all the willing inhabitants on earth. And that is why the preacher at Ecclesiastic 2 says at verse 11, that there is nothing to be gained under the sun, because ultimately it's just the same thing that is being repackaged, the same type of human mentality of needing to feed oneself, even if it's done in a 21st century kind of way. But ultimately, if the devil is repackaging things, and if we are willingly taking it, whether we know it's from the devil or not, or whether we willingly want to engage in any case, then we become spiritually weak and self-indulgent people, because in focusing on